Hey everyone, it is April 23, 2014, and right now we're going to discuss Apple's Q2 2014 earnings and all the week's news. This is the iMore Show. Joining me, as always, someone whose depth of knowledge about stock splits and dividend payments equals my own, Mr. Peter Cohen. How are you, Peter?
And that is what we call damning with faint praise.
Yeah, I can't speak intelligently about this stuff, but I can recount what Apple has said. How's that?
There we go. Okay, yeah, I can do about the same. I think that puts us on about the same level as an African gray parrot.
Well, so we have a Umiastowski for that.
Which in fairness, are some of the most intelligent birds that are out there, but still.
They're the ones that'll get saved when the hitchhikers come back for us.
That's right.
All right, so let's take a quick look at what happened. Apple announced 43.7 million iPhones sold, 16.3 million iPads, 4.1 million Macs, and a couple million iPods. Let's just put a bullet in the iPod now. I mean, it's still selling better than a lot of gadgets, but it is no longer that business which in days of old made Apple important.
Yeah, absolutely. The iPod's days are far, far behind it at this point. The iPod's best days, rather. I don't think we need to put a bullet in its head yet. People are still buying them. You know, the iPod Touch serves an important place in the ecosystem, especially for parents who, have kids who want an iPhone but aren't necessarily responsible enough to have a phone. We can keep it around, but I don't really see Apple putting a lot of energy into it from here on out.
Well, I think it's being attacked on several fronts. I think you have the iPad mini, which is a lot more attractive to people, especially with smaller kids or who just simply want a bigger surface for which not to use a phone on. And I think the iPhone 5C was sort of that popular iPhone that you might as well just get a phone. And I think if we ever do see an Apple wearable, it is more likely to replace, remember that tie clip iPod Shuffle and that shoulder clip iPod Nano? Because those were already wearables. They were just wearables that didn't run iOS.
Indeed, they were, yes. And of course, the iPod Nano still doesn't run iOS.
No, it kind of looks like she ain't pretty. She just looks that way.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so moving on to Macs, we're going to go this in reverse set of order. I know a lot of people are extremely bullish on the Mac market, and Apple said, I forget the number, but it was 31 out of 32, or some ludicrously high number of quarters where the Mac has outpaced the market. Yes,
indeed. The Mac continues to defy the odds, although the PC market is absolutely getting hammered, especially by tablet sales. Macs continue to sell pretty well, and surprisingly, Macs once again sold well in this particular quarter, defying the expectations, I think, of many that are out there. Revenue for the Mac stayed pretty flat from quarter to quarter, but unit sales were actually up, which shows that people were spending less money on their Macs, but were getting more machines, more lower-priced machines. So it's an interesting indication.
Yeah, it was 31 out of the last 32 quarters. And I know some people, Ben Beharon, for example, is incredibly bullish on the Mac, and he thinks that it will continue to grow, and as PC falls, as Windows falls, the Mac will gain more and more share of whatever truck/PC market remains. But I think one of the interesting things there too, Peter, is that these numbers reflect a market where there's been no Mac Mini refresh. The Mac Pro remains hugely constrained. The MacBook Air refresh was a year ago in June. The new Mac Pros, were mostly a bump this year. iMacs mostly a bump this year. It seems like we're primed for new Macs as well that could even further increase Apple's.
I think you're right, and I think that the beginning of the year, the first few months of the year is a tough time for Apple to release new Macs because there is this buying trend where Macs, the sale of Macs sort of drop through the next few months. So I expect, my expectation anyway, is that we are going to see something new from Apple on the Mac side at WWDC in June. So that's another couple of months away. but I don't really see too much happening between now and then. That means that Apple's not going to have any new Macs to sell until the halfway point of the year. And typically Apple will have some kind of Mac refresh in June, and then we'll follow that up with some kind of Mac refresh in the fall. Assuming that past is prologue and they do the same thing that they've done for the past few years, that would be the cycle that we would expect to see. Hopefully, Mac sales will continue to do well, and we'll continue to see some new stuff come out of Apple. But this is kind of a difficult year because Apple is still very dependent on Intel's product cycle in order to refresh its products. And Intel is late with its Broadwell chips, which are the replacement for the Haswell chips that made it into most Macs in 2013. So this is going to be kind of a head-scratching year, I think, for what Apple is going to do to really push the envelope on the Mac.
Benji Kindle is asking, on a scale of 1 to BlackBerry, Peter, how doomed does this make Apple?
Oh, doomed beyond all recovery. No, it's ridiculous. I mean, Apple is still making money hand over fist. They're still an incredibly profitable company, and they're still doing incredibly well. I mean, iPhone sales absolutely crushed it this year. It's incredible, and a lot of that is on the strength of Apple sales in China.
Oh, so let's get into that. 16.3 million iPads sold. Now, this number was down, but Apple had a couple reasons for why it was down, aside from lower demand.
Yeah, Tim Cook actually, uncharacteristically, it was really kind of interesting. First of all, as soon as Apple's financial figures were released, the analysts and the financial reporters got their knives out and said, oh, iPad sales are abysmal. iPad sales were millions off from where analysts expected it. And, a lot of times, when we've talked about Apple's financial numbers in the past, and a lot of the people who I read about, when I read commentary from other tech journalists and financial analysts whose opinions I respect, they bring up the same point, that what Wall Street thinks and what Apple thinks are usually two entirely different numbers. And unless Apple's figures meet or exceed Wall Street's, then Wall Street typically takes it as bad news. Apple's executive staff are usually very content not to say a word about that and just stick to the script, stick to the information that they want to impart, provide any clarity, any granularity, as the analysts like to say.
Color, Peter,
color and granularity that they feel is important, but otherwise don't necessarily go off script that much. This time, Tim Cook took the bull by the horns, and I thought it was really great to see, and said, look, iPad sales, in point of fact, were on the high side of our guidance, meaning what Apple had told investors the quarter before that they were expecting to do. But, they were on the low side of analysts' expectations. The discrepancy, he explained, was in two parts. One is because last year, for the second quarter, Apple dramatically increased the amount of iPad inventory that was out there. So there were a lot more iPads available for sale, and people bought a lot more iPads. This year, it was sort of the opposite. They actually entered the quarter with a backlog of orders for iPad minis with Retina display, and they tried to get down that level of inventory over the quarter. The interesting thing is that even taking that into account, there was still a decline, but the decline, as Luca Maestri, who is Apple's VP of Finance, explained, the difference in sell-in and sell-through was very different from what those numbers might look like otherwise. Sell-through numbers were only off by 3%. Sell-through is the figure that companies use to figure out how many products are actually in customers' hands, how many people have bought the product. Sell-in is the amount that ends up in distributors' hands and in retailers' hands. So those aren't units that have been sold yet. Sell-in was 3% lower year over year. Sell-through was 16% lower. year over year. So that discrepancy actually isn't as big as some analysts first made it out to be.
Yeah, it was interesting for a couple things, and I'll just go back for a second. Tim Cook kicked off this conference call. Usually Peter Oppenheimer in the past has kicked off those calls. Peter Oppenheimer, of course, is retiring. He'll be retiring later on in this year. Luca, how do you pronounce the name? Maestri?
Maestri, yeah.
Maestri, yeah. He'll be taking over as the new CFO. Tim Cook gave Oppenheimer a beautiful send-off, that he had an unparalleled record among CFOs. So Cook got right into this. And the other thing he did is he made sure that he announced like the numbers for iPad usage were still very high in enterprise, in education. His favorite CustSat term is off the charts. Usage metrics are off the charts. I think the only thing he mentioned that wasn't that high was retail at something like 45 or 47%. But he said that includes a ton of devices that Apple would never include in the same category as an iPad.
And that figure from NPD is very specifically U.S. retail, not worldwide. Yeah. But yeah, 46%. And Tim Cook dumped some water on it and said, look, these are devices that represent markets that Apple just wouldn't compete in.
And he also said, interestingly, that Apple is incredibly happy about the iPads they are still making, the next generations of iPads, and what they can do to further increase the value of that, which doesn't say anything, but it's still, when Tim Cook says something like that, it's interesting.
Yeah, and it's reassuring to hear that, Apple still considers the iPad, and we all know this, that the Apple considers the iPad a key product. Tim Cook came out with some really interesting figures when he was talking about this, in sort of giving an analyst his long view of the iPad after the initial preamble during the question and answer session with analysts. Cook mentioned that to date, Apple has sold over 210 million iPads. And that Apple has, in point of fact, in the same period of time, sold something like 1/7 the number of iPods and maybe half the number of iPhones.
Yeah, it was the fastest growing product in their history, and I think one of them in consumer electronics history.
Right, exactly, and fastest growing product in Apple's history. So, when people are looking for Apple to do the next iPad or wondering why iPad sales aren't as great as they were, compared to the same quarter last year, you have to keep in mind that this is an explosively growing market, and that in the metrics that count, Apple is doing really well. For example, Cook mentioned education, and how in both education and in Fortune 500 enterprise usage, Apple is well over 90% market share. So Apple is doing very well in the segments at which it operates. There's an entire different part of the market that Apple doesn't really operate in, and that's the low end of the tablet market, and Apple leaves that to competitors. And
that's similar to netbooks in the old computer days, right?
It's also similar to the way that Apple operates in the smartphone space. People knock Apple, analysts knock Apple for not having a cheap smartphone. But if you actually take a look at Apple's percentage of profit for the segment of the smartphone market that it operates in, Apple is the clear winner compared to everybody else in the market, including Samsung. So
one of the things that I thought was really interesting with the iPad, and Cook spent a considerable amount of time trying to point out all these things, is that acceleration. So if you have, for example, a Lamborghini Aventador, and you have a Toyota Yaris or whatever, and you put them both on a highway with a speed limit of 100, and you tell them to go for it, that Aventador is going to scream to 100 miles an hour. The Yaris, not so much. Like, it'll get there, but it'll get there slowly. And it'll look like the Aventador is a much bigger product, but they're still both going to stop at 100 miles. And what I mean by that is, Cook said again, and he's repeated this many times, and I think Jobs said this beforehand, that they see the tablet market as growing to be larger than the PC market, and Apple growing with it. But at a certain point, the PC market matured. At a certain point, the tablet market will mature. Pretty much everyone who has a tablet is going to want one, and then it'll be into the upgrade cycle game, which we saw in PCs. So I think the expectations of the market, and this is another case where they're not aligned with the realities and the laws of economics and just how the world works.
Yeah, I suspect you're right, and I suspect that we're still a long way off from seeing that market maturation point. Although, uh, I'm sure that some analysts and some reporters are sort of carving their knife on this iPad number, saying that's it, Apple's day in the sun with these tablets is over, and it's going to get its ass kicked by the Kindle and, the Galaxy Tab and whatever
A
else.
$10 video player in China from a no-name manufacturer.
Right, exactly. Something that's going to come in your cereal box this Christmas.
But I am interested in this because you and I are geeks, and you and I get new devices almost every year, if not every year. I don't yet know, and I'm sure there are some analysts that know this. I don't yet know what the product cycle is for a normal person with an iPad. Like my mom still has an iPad 2. She has an iPad 3 that I gave her after that, but she's felt no pressure to go to an iPad Air, for example. My sister had an iPad 2, and she just upgraded to the iPad Mini Retina. That was the first time she felt compelled to upgrade, and that was 2-3 years later. So I don't know if it's going to be a yearly product. I don't necessarily know that it has to be a yearly product for most people.
I don't think it does. I think Apple is compelled to have a yearly upgrade for it, but I don't think that customers are buying these every year. And I'm just drawing anecdotally on my experience working in working for an Apple reseller, because the customers who I help, who come in for new iPad minis with Retina display or new iPad Airs, many of them are buying iPads for the first time. It's exactly what Tim Cook was talking about during his call. It turns out that 2/3 of the people who buy iPads have never owned an iPad before. Mm-hmm. That's certainly consistent with my experience. The people who are coming into the store to buy it maybe have a Kindle, or maybe have borrowed or ever received an iPad from a family member and it's an older model. The people who are repeat customers are often upgrading from first-generation iPads. I mean the very first-generation iPad, which hasn't had an operating system update since iOS 5.11. Yep. So these are devices that are antique, by our measure, but they're still serving these people very well, and they're just running into problems with games that they want to play, apps that they want to download, not available for them because iOS 6 might be the baseline level of compatibility that's supported. So, I don't think that the iPad is an annual device upgrade, and part of it also, I think, is because people take better care of their iPads than they do their iPhones. The iPad isn't in their pocket all the time. They're not taking their iPads with them all the time. A lot of times the iPad stays at home. It might stay on the coffee table or the nightstand, or whatever, but it's not necessarily a portable device. It's a device that gets used around the house. So the use case for it is a little bit different, and people don't feel the need to go out and replace it every time Apple upgrades. So that's something that'll be very interesting to see how Apple handles in the years to come.
Yeah, I agree. I wonder if it'll fall into something where like the iPad 2 was a big inflection point, and then the iPad Air is another one, or the iPad Mini with Retina, if they'll be hallmark products.
Well, the interesting thing is that Apple, when Apple finally discontinued the iPad 2 just about a month ago, I think, a month and a half or so, they replaced it with the fourth-generation iPad. They sort of pulled the fourth-generation iPad out of mothballs, and this is a solid iPad. The fourth-generation iPad has a Retina display. It's got a fast processor. It's very well equipped. It's a really nice piece of equipment, and it certainly will do people a lot better than the iPad 2. And the demand is there. People don't want to spend $500 on a new iPad if they can get a full-sized iPad for $400 that's almost as good. That's a very appealing proposition for them. I think Apple was very smart to haul that one out of mothballs, and I'll be very interested to see how long it stays in the product matrix now.
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit too early to hear what that does to the mix numbers as opposed to the iPad 2, but I'll be likewise interested to see it. Moving on to iPhones. 43.7 million iPhones sold. At the risk of parodying myself, doomed.
Doomed.
Oh, doomed.
43.7 million iPads. Turns out that there are a lot of Chinese people who iPhones. A lot of Chinese people really like the iPhone.
Yeah, so they were fired. So earlier in the year, they sold way more iPhone 5Ss than they expected, and the mix was high for them. This year, this quarter, the story was a lot about emerging markets. Of course, they said that France and Canada and Germany and the UK and the US were all good markets. Actually, I don't know if they mentioned Canada, but the US, the UK, the usual suspects. But also Greater China.
I figure Canada has to be in the mix because you people have a better middle class than we do now.
Just the number that I buy alone. 17% iPhone growth over the last year. The addition of China Mobile. Japan was up 50%. 15.4 million iPhones in channel. It was impressive, but the iPhone 4, I believe he said, accounted for a single-digit percentage, so that wasn't a big deal. But the iPhone 4S and even the iPhone 5C and the amount of new to iPhone and switching from Android to iPhone users, I think, was especially interesting.
Yeah, the iPhone 4 number, Tim sort of disregarded the iPhone 4 as basically, not a big performer. iPhone 4 is still available in emerging markets. It's available in India, for example, so it's kind of interesting to hear that it's being tepidly received there.
Well, it was the bottom of the rung. It was put into the markets where there are competing Android phones that are, I think, around $50 or $100. But again, only Brazil, only India, only China, I think, for those markets.
Yeah.
But it's something you said too. The bigger opportunity for Apple is it's still only 1 billion smartphones, but it'll eventually overtake the market. And the ability to track new users. So the iPhone numbers for the 4S, 80%. Sorry, I can't even read my own writing now. The new to iPhone numbers. So iPhone 4S was 80%. So 80% of new iPhone owners. 80% of new iPhone 4, 80% of iPhone 4S owners were new to the iPhone, and I think it was a close number. Here we go, lots of it. 69% of iPhone 5C buyers were first-time iPhone buyers. Also heavy Android switchers. 62% of iPhone 4S. 60% of iPhone 5C buyers switched from Android. Those are good numbers for Apple.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are, and all the numbers sort of underscore one important factor for Apple that is very telling and very important, and that is that there's still a lot of new customers coming to the platforms. Coming to the iPhone, coming to the iPad, even coming to the Macintosh. These are people who have never had one of these devices before and are anxious to give it a try. A lot of times, with the iPad or the Mac, it's because they've had a positive experience with the iPhone. A lot of times with the iPhone, it's conversely because they've had a positive experience with some other Apple product, or just, they've learned through friends, relatives, talking to people, reading reviews that the iPhone is very highly rated, and are expecting to have a really good experience compared to what their last experience was.
Now, they did say that, I think it was Luca who said that as we get further away from product launches, the mix turns into a lower ASP. The ASP was down considerably. I think it was $41 per. I think $41 was the magical number, but that was due to the higher mix of 4S and I think maybe 5C.
Indeed.
I can't claim to understand all this stuff, but we'll have Chris Umiastowski do a follow-up for us. One of the things that was interesting is 800 million iTunes accounts now, many of which have credit cards attached to them?
800 million, most of which have credit card accounts attached to them, which is an astonishing number. Almost 1 billion accounts. That's just amazing to me.
Yeah, the analyst had to ask again because she said it had been so long since they'd heard the number that growth was just astronomical. And Cook said that wasn't all App Store. And it's interesting because software and services, I think, was around $1 billion business for Apple this quarter. And we don't think about Apple as a software and services company, but Apple, if you take everything else away, Apple is still a hugely successful software and services company. Yeah,
well, if you think about the ecosystems that power both the Macintosh and the iOS devices, it makes sense. Apple has had to create these big and of course iTunes as well. Apple has had to create these big, incredibly successful service organizations in order to keep feeding these monsters that they make.
Yeah, and it's something because everyone is looking for the next big thing from Apple, and arguably we've gone over this before. There isn't any next big thing, but there's a lot of things that can be more valuable. And there were a couple interesting questions on that. One was, Apple's strategy compared to Google and Amazon and other players and Facebook, who are far more diversified, who sort of seem to have their hand in every pot, and whether Apple is maybe too focused in terms of acquisitions and strategy.
Tim gave a very good answer to this too. I thought he said, "Look, we don't have to be the first to market with a new product, and if you look at our track record, we very rarely are. You know, tablets were around for a decade before the iPad came out. We certainly weren't the first MP3 player on the block. We weren't the first smartphone maker on the block, but we made smartphones into what they are today. We made tablets into what they are today, and we completely reinvented the MP3 market." You know, the bottom line is Apple is not necessarily interested in dipping its toes into unknown waters, but Apple is singularly focused on making a product that works well and that actually fits a need that its customers have.
And a similar question was about the Kindle Fire TV. Sorry, the Amazon Fire TV is getting the HBO Go app, which Apple already has, but also Amazon Prime Video service is getting 3-year-old HBO content. Apple has the Apple TV, but they don't have any of these sorts of streaming services. They've dipped their toe in with iTunes Radio, but there's no equivalent video service from Apple yet. And I guess the question was, is that something Apple should get into? Should Apple be providing streaming the way Netflix does, or the way that Amazon Prime Video does?
I don't know. What do you think?
I think there is an element of the market that is moving away from ownership of every digital good towards subscription and streaming services. I think that's probably why, famously Steve Jobs said people want to own their music, but now we have iTunes Radio. And it's getting to a point where people simply can't own everything, or the value of something does not equal ownership, but it may equal subscription or rental of that. I know Apple tried rental TV shows, and that didn't work out.
I certainly think that that's the trend in music. I don't think there's any question that Pandora, Spotify, and their ilk, and even iTunes Radio, although I have read things that suggest that iTunes Radio hasn't been as big a deal for Apple as some were expecting it to be, have really bitten into music sales. But I don't necessarily, we've talked about this on the show before, Rene. The video market is so incredibly different and so incredibly calcified in the way that they're currently getting revenue. I don't think Apple really has an opportunity to compete in the same way that they did in music. Certainly not.
Yeah, I don't also think that Apple yes, Apple does suffer when they are dependent upon other people because they can't control the end-to-end experience. But for example, they've made a very good Netflix experience on, well, both them and Netflix have made for a very good Netflix experience on iOS. On the Apple TV, it's a little bit challenged with long buffering times. It's the only device that won't do continue on to the next episode once you get to it. So there are things that can be improved there, but I don't know if I have a suspicion that Apple believes, and that they may correctly believe, that they are better able to supply a fantastic experience for existing streaming services than having to do all of that stuff themselves.
I think you're right, and I think that Apple is certainly content to partner with other companies to provide the content for that when it makes sense to. Let's face it, though, the Apple TV is long in the tooth. That's a product that I think Apple really needs to refresh in 2014 and really needs to add some value to. Having said that, let's face it, the Amazon Fire TV is the first device that we've seen in that market in a very long time that has any features that make it a more compelling option than the Apple TV. So this is still a market that's relatively balanced in Apple's favor.
I know there were rumors of an Apple TV refresh this spring, which obviously didn't pan out, but I agree with you. An Apple TV, it was last refreshed first quarter 2012. We're now first quarter 2015. It doesn't have the latest hardware, single-core A5.
2014.
2014, sorry. Single-core A5 processor, 8 gigabytes of storage, 512.
It's an iPad 2 under the hood. It's an old
really
system.
It really is. And a device like that, I don't know if they would ever do a deal for Amazon Prime Video. The only thing that bothers me somewhat, and I mentioned this on TNT earlier today, is that absent iTunes, I feel like I have a bunch of fiefdoms that I have to negotiate to get what I want to watch. Like I have to figure out where can I watch West Wing? What service is that on? Where can I watch? Whatever show I want to watch, I have to figure out where it is. And maybe Universal Spotlight search from Apple TV fixes that. But I still wish there was a one-stop shop I could go to just get the TV and movies that I want.
And you know what? I would be perfectly content if the Apple TV were able to negotiate with the different devices that I use to access that content, right? Because, like, my TiVo interacts with Comcast and Comcast's on-demand service in a very particular way. Sometimes it balances out in favor of using the TiVo and its built-in apps and Netflix and so on through the TiVo in order to find the content that I want. Sometimes I can get it through Comcast directly. Sometimes I go to my actual recorded content on the TiVo. Sometimes I can't find what I'm looking for on Comcast's on-demand service, so I end up firing up the Apple TV and going to Netflix or Crunchyroll or one of the other channels that's on the Apple TV box to get what I want. It's been said before that the best kind of user interface is just a big red button that says do it. I want my Apple TV to be that device.
Just do it.
I just either want to talk to it like I can with Siri, kind of like Gary Busey does with the Fire TV. My kids think that Gary Busey is out of his mind, and I think that's the whole point of that ad. I either want to be able to do that, or I want to be able to very simply tell Apple TV, this is what I want to see, or just show me everything that I can watch, and I don't care what service it's on. I shouldn't have to negotiate through 40 channels on my Apple TV to find what I'm looking for. There's got to be an easier way to present that information to me and make it compelling for me to want to watch.
Well, 9to5Mac did find strings for Siri for Apple TV lying around places, so there's always hope here.
There is hope, yes.
Also, on the Apple TV side, Gene Munster showed up, didn't ask about an Apple television, but did ask Tim Cook why he took the hobby label off the Apple TV, and he referred back to that $1 billion business, and that it just wasn't right, Peter, to keep calling it a hobby.
Yeah, it's not right to keep calling it a hobby. That's true. It is a big bottom line for Apple. At the Apple TV, Apple doesn't sell $1 billion worth of Apple TV every year, but between the sales of the Apple TV and the other stuff that people access to the Apple TV, Apple's making $1 billion a year on those sales. So there's some, it's a significant bottom line.
Yeah, there was I think I had the iTunes number wrong previously. I said $1 billion for iTunes, but it was $1 billion just for the Apple TV. I don't have the iTunes numbers in front of me, but iTunes numbers, of course, were much bigger than that because they include the iOS App Store and the Mac App Store and the music and all that kind of stuff. There were some questions about pricing. There were rumors earlier this year that Apple might seek to increase the price that they charged carriers for an iPhone 6, thinking that the value of an iPhone 6 was greater than previous iPhones. There's also been constant whining about Apple not being in that ultra-low end. We just saw over on Android Central the OnePlus One phone, which is spec'd almost identically to a Galaxy S4, and it starts, I think, $200 or $300 off contract. But again, going back to that netbook market, Peter, I can't help but think that Apple wants no part of the race to the bottom and the pressure on margins and the self-destructive nature of that kind of business.
Yeah, and for anybody who's wondering why it isn't, all we have to do is rewind our time machine back to the 90s. When Apple, did try to compete in that market with crappy, undifferentiated Performa computers, and went toe-to-toe with licensees that were making Mac-compatible systems, companies like SuperMac and UMax and Power Computing. And were having their butts handed to them because these companies were coming up with products that work just as well as their own at a lower price. Apple is not interested in repeating history. It's not interested in operating in the low end of the market, and we shouldn't expect it to. If Apple were able to do it in a meaningful way, I don't think that they would be averse to it, but they just don't see a way right now to do it and make money and keep the product quality where they think that their customers expect it to be.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and I think that's why in North America they've gone like originally the iPhone in North America was 600 some odd dollars, but then they went with the subsidy model. So now a new iPhone based model is $200, and in those emerging markets, which Cook rightly pointed out, were doing very well for Apple, naysayers notwithstanding, the iPhone 4S, which is I think $450 US off contract, and the iPhone 4 in those three markets didn't really make an impact, but the 4S certainly did at what's not really a budget price, but is a much less expensive iPhone price.
For sure, and I'm a big believer in buying stuff off contract because you end up saving money if you can figure out a good deal to go with your carrier. And you know what? Even AT&T is offering a fair deal for people who are bringing their own products with them when they start a line with AT&T. So the carriers coming around slowly but surely. T-Mobile's been the hugely disruptive force in this market. They're the ones who started doing it a year ago, and they've had, they're sort of the Apple of the American cell phone market. They've had a very disruptive influence.
I think that's true. We talked about the iPad upgrade cycle, and Cook was asked about the iPhone upgrade cycle and whether all these new and different carrier plans are either helping it or hurting it. And he mentioned that it was really hard to tell because some of them encourage you to spend more money up front and get newer phones faster, one a year maybe, while other ones encourage you to keep your phone and enjoy significant savings in the long run. And I know you've been wrestling with this as you try to keep track of the best carrier deals, Peter, but it looks like there's no easy answers right now.
No, there really aren't any easy answers, and part of it is because the carriers, I think, are always trying to play a shell game. They're always trying to make things look rosier than they actually are. But having said that, the needle is moving. I just don't think the needle is moving fast enough for how many of us would like. I just want the carriers to be a dumb pipe.
Yes.
And
the dumber the better.
Exactly. The stupider the better. And just sell me access over their network, and don't bother with any of this other garbage.
Give me an IP, send my packets and shut up.
But the problem that I have when I'm talking to muggles especially is the same conversation over and over where they believe they're getting their phone for $200 or $100 or no bucks. Mm-hmm. You're not. You're spending a lot more than that. And to call it a subsidy is insulting to what's really happened. You are paying a stiff fine, a stiff penalty to whatever carrier you're financing your phone through typically.
Some people call them loan sharks.
Yeah, exactly. Get better points from your loan shark than you do from your cell phone company.
The last thing I wanted to bring up was the dreaded new product categories and new products. Tim Cook put in the press release this time, that Apple is working on new products. Of course they are. They're not going out of business. There will be another iPhone. There will be new iPads. There will be new Macs. We know this for sure. He had previously said, and I'm guessing he would if he had his druthers who could do it over again, he wouldn't have said that, but he said things that reasonable people would consider new product categories across 2014. It's that cross thing that that gets some people on Twitter sort of fiery, not on Twitter, but in general sort of fiery about this. I don't know how it doesn't confuse me, Peter. It frustrates me so much because it feels like he's a little bit succumbing to the pressure of the insane market by saying that kind of stuff. Because Apple never had to say, like when everyone was rumoring an iPhone, everyone was rumoring a tablet, that they're exploring new product categories. I just wish they'd go back to that sort of say nothing, if they could.
Yeah, I mean, the days of Apple saying nothing, I think, are behind it. The Apple does not exist sphinx-like like it did back in the Steve Jobs days, and I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I am with you though, Rene, in that I am very fatigued with hearing stuff about these new product categories and seeing Apple not deliver anything. To be frank, I wasn't really expecting Apple to front load the first half of the year with a lot of product announcements because, cyclically, Apple's, December quarter is its big one in terms of actual revenue. But, it'd be nice if Tim Cook actually, put up instead of teasing us endlessly with this promise of new product categories. The problem that
Apple waffle iron.
Yeah, exactly. An Apple waffle iron or an Apple, what is it? Toaster refrigerator, right?
Peter, you would buy an Apple coffee maker in a hot minute.
Would I buy an Apple coffee maker? It really depends on what the Apple coffee maker did, and I would need my wife's approval, absolutely, because
it's an aluminum AeroPress.
She's the coffee expert in the house, not me. And aluminum, yes. So all I want to hear, by the way, is Luca Maestri say aluminio.
Aluminio. Manaya, why you keep asking me this question? Now I'm gonna get trouble from these.
He's my new favorite foreign accented Apple executive.
After Bertrand Serlet.
After Bertrand Serlet, that's right. I miss Bertrand.
I do too. Redmond, warm up your photocopiers. A couple of questions. Alex Santos says, Tim's early comment on the 800 million credit card holders on their database was interesting. Maybe if it was just a brief point, but does his focus on the figure hold some promise on Touch ID going beyond iTunes Store purchases? So this is something that we hear a lot. Like we hear a lot about people wanting Siri APIs and people wanting Touch ID APIs. And Apple goes very, very slowly with these things for a reason. It's incredibly easy for us to say, I want this API, or to even think that we want these things. But the consequences need to be really, really well thought through. The repercussions need to be really, really thought through. We saw Samsung already with their version of a fingerprint swiper get spoofed, and because there's an API, any developer app gets spoofed, including PayPal, which is something I really don't want spoofed. Apple currently does not provide a Touch ID API because they know that you can't really stop that spoofing yet, and they're not going to offer it until it is as... Let me put it another way. The Apple 30-page security document, I linked to Steve Gibson's 3-podcast roundup of it, is a thing of beauty. He called it an amazing crypto brick, but it really is incredibly well thought out. And Touch ID APIs and endpoints are going to be incredibly well thought out. And just exposing that does no good to anybody. All it does is cause a headline when your Starbucks card gets charged $1,000. Or Siri sounds great, but then I say add this to my calendar, and Fantastical and Calendar.app and Awesome Calendar and Calendar 5 all start crashing my phone trying to compete for who gets control of that API call. So I would expect Apple to move slowly with that. But Peter, I do think there is a lot more in the planning stages for Touch ID than we've seen so far. First, if not only getting it on the iPad.
Absolutely, and I think that many of us are so anxious to see Touch ID spread out to other Apple products because Touch ID is so elegantly implemented on the iPhone 5S and makes using the iPhone 5S so easy in so many ways. That we just assume that it will be a natural progression to get it on other products. And why isn't Apple doing this faster? Why isn't this a higher priority? It's because Apple wants that same level of elegance, simplicity, and, quite frankly, invisibility to the user in those other products as well. And that takes time, it takes engineering, and it takes a little time for it to get right. And it goes back to what I was talking about before, where Tim Cook said, look, we don't necessarily need to be the first to market. We just want to have the right product when the time is right. And the same principle goes for the implementation of Touch ID. I have no doubt that within the next few years we're going to see Touch ID spread out to everything else. But Apple's got to do it its own way, and it's got to be absolutely sure that it's got all of its T's crossed and I's dotted to do it.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's all fun and games when AntennaGate, gives you some frustration with a phone signal, or Siri doesn't connect to the network and doesn't answer your responses. But when you're talking about people's money, that is super serious. Apple takes that
completely different story. Yeah,
Apple takes that incredibly seriously, and we're going to see that roll out. I think, like we both were saying, very. I asked too. Like I was asking people in the industry about what if my iPhone could authenticate me, and then that could go over Bluetooth as a trusted object, and they're saying, well, you really have to make sure the Bluetooth endpoints are secure. And there have been cases of people sniffing RFID and sniffing NFC transactions and things like that. So I don't want to see anything from Apple that's not bolted down. I would rather wait than get dumbass products like we see from a lot of their competitors.
That's exactly right.
Quite frankly. All right, so moving on, Peter, there was some other news I wanted to ask you about this week. And this is something Alex mentioned in the chat room too. Apple has opened up a beta seed program for everyone, not just those of us with developer accounts.
Yeah, and I have very mixed feelings about this. I don't think this is the first time they've done this either, but it's been the first time in a while. The bottom line is that Apple is enabling anybody, not just registered developers, to enroll in their beta seed program to try out pre-release software. I posted an editorial earlier today outlining 5 reasons why I think that you should think twice before doing it. I don't necessarily want to dissuade anybody from enrolling in it, but I think that you really need to think carefully before you do, because it's nice to have early access to software that the general public doesn't have, but the bottom line is Apple has a long list of disclaimers that you have to agree to implicitly before you can begin to download it. And a lot of people just scan right through those those end-user license agreements, but this one's really worth reading because Apple says, among other things, we don't support you with this. Which means not only are you not going to get any help from Apple directly if you install beta software and run into problems, but if you walk into an Apple store or an Apple reseller looking for support from an Apple genius or the resident tech guy, they can justifiably throw up their hands and say, you know what, we can't help you. You're running beta software. That's out of our control. If your machine gets screwed up, your only solution is to restore from a backup. If this is your only machine, whatever you do, don't run the beta software. It's your production machine, for God's sake. It also may be in violation of, if you're using this machine at work or at school, it may be in violation of specific rules that those institutions have put in place for how the machine can be used, so you should check with them first. There are a lot of good reasons not to do it. Having said that, look, if you're technically sophisticated, if you got a spare machine lying around, and you want access to the beta program, then by all means, go ahead and do it. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Just understand that this isn't for everyone, and if the idea of going solo and flying without a net is maybe not right for you, it would definitely be to your advantage to wait for right now.
Do you have any idea? The thing that occurred to me, Peter, and this is the question I try to ask myself, is why? Like, why would Apple? Granted, there's been a huge shakeup at Apple over the last couple of years. A whole bunch of new people are running OS 10. But why do this? Will the feedback they get be valuable? Will it help them avoid things like the Gmail bugs or the Mail.app bugs in general in Mavericks, or the core audio bugs or things like that?
The core audio bugs that they still haven't fixed.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what the upside is here.
You know, I think that is the upside. The upside is a much larger pool of victims to sort of test this stuff out on than Apple's been able to have access to up until now. You know, developers who have up until now been sort of the traditional fodder for these beta programs come with a very specific set of expectations. You know, they're beta testing the software specifically to stress test it for use with their own applications, because they want to make sure that their software works right on day one when 10.9.3 or 10.9.2 or whatever come out. And that makes a lot of sense, but it also gives them a pretty narrow focus. And I think that the reason why some of these problems have come out is because they're use cases that just kind of slip through the cracks based on the pool of people who are being exposed to them. So it's better for Apple to be able to pull from a wide base of users who may have different use cases, who may have different equipment, and may have very different environments than the relatively limited base of beta testers that Apple usually can reach out to. I don't expect that, and I may be totally wrong on this, but I don't expect that this is something like if you enroll today that you're going to be getting a beta copy of 10.10 the day that it's announced at WWDC. I think that that's still going to remain the domain of registered developers very specifically. But if you want access to new builds of 10.9 or certain key applications like iTunes and Mail and Safari, this might be a good way to go about it without having to pay the $99 a year fee.
I mean, I hesitate to say it, but it's almost Microsoftian, because they've been doing very public betas for their new versions of Windows for a long time now.
You know what? You can say a lot of things about Microsoft, but Microsoft's development process for its technology is something that Apple could actually learn a lot from.
I will not disagree with you. How'd you like that? People who call us fanboys. So yeah, I agree with you. I don't think we'll be seeing 10.10. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I think that the early betas, the things that are formative, the things that are radical changes that Apple needs to solidify before they become usable on an everyday machine, as no doubt millions of people who aren't developers who engage in these programs will. I also don't think we'll see an iOS equivalent. I think if we did, we would have seen it announced at roughly the same time. The iPhone just is such a different sort of device. It's much more like an appliance, and I don't think that an open beta would be in anyone's best interests.
Yeah, especially not Apple's. No, I don't see the same thing happening for iPhone users. Sorry, folks.
All right, Mason Lancaster is asking Peter. I'm going to pretend he's asking you. Will Apple ever decide to lower the outrageous prices they are charging for flash memory and RAM upgrades?
Yeah, they will over time. Apple controls a big chunk of that market, and I'm sure that their profit margins on that stuff are ridiculous compared to what other vendors make. We've seen some adjustments over time. We'll continue to see some adjustments. Somehow, though, I don't think that you're ever going to see Apple on a level playing field with sourcing your own components from Newegg or Micro Center or whatever. I don't think that that's ever going to happen. But over time, it's reasonable to expect Apple to adjust prices to improve value there. Having said that, Apple seems very set in its ways. And the way that it does things is really kind of funny. Like when you're buying a new iPad or a new iPhone, you pay an extra $100 to double the storage. If the storage goes from 16 to 32, you're paying $100. If it goes from 32 to 64, you're paying another $100. I don't exactly know that it scales. I don't think that it scales quite the same way when you're actually looking at component prices. But the way that Apple has tiered it certainly works to their advantage.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with this is you can't view this as economics. You have to view this as marketing. You have to position. There's this old joke that you have three versions of every product. You have the cheap one that gets you in the door. You have the expensive one for people who make way too much money, and you have the middle of the road one that almost everyone ends up buying. And that's very clear in some products because they just have, like the cheap microwave has less features than the middle of the line microwave, has less good materials than the top of the line microwave. In computers and phones, the way Apple does them, that's not really what they do. Like it would be hard pressed for them to make an iPhone 5S 16 gigabytes that had actually less features, or it's not even 60, but like an iPhone 5S that was differentiated by features at price points. But what people can see, what they can easily understand, whether it makes component sense or not, is it's got more storage, therefore it is a higher tier, therefore it is more valuable. So Apple uses the margins in RAM, in flash storage, to pay for other things, and overall it comes out to to the average margin for the product. But it's just a convenient marketing way to explain those tiers to consumers in a way that they're willing to digest.
Yeah, exactly, yes.
A couple other things that I wanted to get into. One is Tim Cook narrated Apple's new environmental video better, and it was interesting, Peter, because I didn't expect that. Apple CEOs don't traditionally do that. Tim Cook did do a reading for the crazy ones, but ended up going with Richard Dreyfuss for that spot. But Tim Cook did read it, and it kind of fit for me because Tim Cook has made such a point of being the Apple core values guy, telling shareholders who questioned whether caring for the environment was worth the cut on the bottom line to sell their stock. Shut up and sell your stock, basically. It seems like an area he's passionate for, and I think he'll never wear the visionary hat or the founder hat that Steve Jobs had, but being the center of Apple's values, I think, is a hat he could wear.
Absolutely, I agree with you, and I also think that it plays to Tim Cook's personality really well. Tim Cook has a sort of a gentle, avuncular sort of presentation in these things that I think it connects him in a very emotional way, in a way that we haven't seen before. Plus, his voice isn't as annoying as Steve Jobs was.
Are you saying you
I know
prefer
that's
the
a
Auburn
horrible thing to
accent?
say. Yeah, no, I really do. I like it, and I think that that it plays to his strength, you know, and I think that he can connect with people that way in a way that we haven't seen from Apple before, and that's a really good thing. You know, I'd like to see Tim Cook sort of become the voice of Apple. I'd like to hear that anyway in the advertisements, and I don't think that they're gonna haul this out for every ad that Apple does. But within the context of what they were doing for Earth Day this week, you know, with the message of, you know, Apple being very proactive when it comes to environmental responsibility, that's an important corporate positioning statement, and it was good to hear the Apple CEO present it.
And they had their, I forget her name, I think it's Ms. Jackson, formerly of the Environmental Protection Agency, their new Apple VP of Green or the Environment or whatever, did a great feature with Stephen Levy on just what Apple is doing to improve the environment. But I agree with you. As much as I think, and I wrote this earlier in the year, as much as I think Steve Jobs was the "it just works" Apple CEO, I think I think Tim Cook has really taken on that "we believe" mantle, and I think it does work for him.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gives Apple a bit of soul that I think is important. You know, because a lot of people sort of disparage Apple as this. You know, this corporate entity that just makes shiny trinkets that superficial people like. And the message that we keep hearing from Tim Cook over and over again, and the message that we've been hearing from Apple since the beginning of the year with the iPad ad rollout, the reverse rollout, you know, that this company feels not only very passionately about its products, but that it believes that these products have a very meaningful place in its users' lives. And it wants to make sure to express that in a significant way. I mean, say what you want about both of them. I know that some people have just brushed them off as highfalutin nonsense, but I think that it's again, a corporate position that we haven't heard from Apple before that I think makes a lot of sense for those of us who are familiar with their products and hopefully will impart some new understanding to people who maybe don't know Apple as well as you, me, and the people who are watching this.
Yeah, and speaking of which, there was another new Apple commercial which you spotted during Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. last night called Powerful, where it has the name of the song, I'm blanking on it for the moment.
It's Gigantic by the Pixies.
Yeah, and that again, it was showing the iPhone in music, it was showing the iPhone in health, it was showing the iPhone in a bunch of areas. It wasn't the app for that commercials because it wasn't just abstractly showing apps on a phone, it was showing how they were used in everyday work and life. And I think, again, that's the best kind of ad that Apple can do.
Yeah, and Apple's also posted some information on their website explaining which apps were shown in that ad. So it isn't just lip service to you can do these wonderful things. They actually want to show people how other people are using them. But you know, for me, Pixie is one of our favorite bands. You know, hearing this cover of it done by this kids rock group, I think was really great.
Oh, they targeted you, Peter. They got you right where
they did. They got me right in the feels on this one.
They found what was left of your calcified heart, and they just exploited it.
They did.
So the last thing I want to bring up, and this is all rumor and conjecture and stuff, but I think it's interesting, is this idea of Nike getting out of the fitness band business. And the rumor is they kind of cleaned house on the Nike Fuel Band staff. And one of the things that have been a big question is if Apple does ever get into wearables, what would happen with Tim Cook because he's on Nike's board of directors, and that would put him in a very Eric Schmidt circa 2007 position. But it occurred to me, regardless of what you think about Nike or Fuel Bands, it reminded me of Sonos. And when I spoke to Sonos at CES a few years ago, they said that they were going to stop making their own remote controls because it made so much more sense just to use the iPhone. It was fantastic hardware, fantastic interface. They could make any app they wanted. They could completely outsource that part of their business to Apple using a device people already knew how to do. And I started to wonder if, as we approach the Internet of Things and connected devices and whatever comes next, and sort of like what they're doing with CarPlay, if it will make sense for companies that aren't primarily hardware companies, like Nike is a shoe company. Maybe Fitbit is a hardware company, but Nike is a shoe company. For those kinds of companies to get out of hardware and to let Apple do that heavy lifting, and it particularly excites me because right now I can take my iPhone with me when I walk and it records my steps in the M7 processor and it shares it with whatever apps tap into that, so it's really convenient. But if I want to leave my iPhone at home and go running with a Nike Fuel Band or go grapple with a Fitbit, that stays in those stay in those sort of silos. And in a health book world, an iOS 8 world, and even an iWatch world, the idea that it doesn't matter what I have with me, that if I have my phone with me or my watch with me or whatever with me, that stuff just gets taken care of. Like the Starbucks card you talk about in Passbook and just synced over iCloud is hugely appealing to me.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's funny because this erupted over the weekend and was a huge technology story for about 18 hours. And then Nike offered not necessarily a correction, but sort of a watered-down adjustment, saying, yeah, there have been some layoffs, but we're still very committed to the Fuel Band SE, which wasn't exactly a denial that they're ramping down their work on this. But here's the bottom line. As you said, Nike is a shoe company. The amount of money that they made on the Fuel Band last year, doesn't compare to even one of their shoe models. It was a microscopic business for a company that is very focused on not just shoes but athletic wear. So Nike stepping back from Fuel Band development isn't that big a deal. What's more, Nike has already shown that it's perfectly willing to work with Apple where it makes sense. Nike's Nike Plus Move application was one of the very first apps available for the iPhone 5s's M7 coprocessor. So
they've been in iPods for years.
Right, exactly. Nike is perfectly willing to work with Apple when it makes sense. So I think that's a good sign that Nike knows where its important business is and is willing to stick to it. But I wouldn't read too much into what that means in terms of Apple's entry into the market, because we don't know what Apple's going to do for a wearable and don't even know how much of a fitness wearable this thing is going to be.
No, but I do know I've got an M7 chip and a Nike app, and I'm fine with that. I don't even use my Fuel Band anymore.
Exactly, yeah. And it's funny because I don't even really think about it. I don't keep my eyes glued on the Move app, and I don't need to. I can pull it up after a week, and it's like, oh yeah, this is everywhere that I've been.
Or not been.
Or not been. Or God, I'm lazy. Yeah, exactly.
All right, Peter. So if people want to read more about the stuff that you're writing, if they want to find you on Twitter, where can they go?
They can go to Flargh, Flargh, and of course on iMore.com.
And you can find me at the same place. You can find me at Rene Ritchie on all the social things. Thank you so much, especially to everyone who joined us live. Neil, Paul, Donald, Almond, long name Sybil, Fibbit the Wit, Alex Santos, Myson Lancaster, and everyone whose name has scrolled past and I can no longer see. But thank you all for joining us. That is absolutely the best way to enjoy the show. If you can't join us live, however, we have the YouTube version of the video. We're also back in iTunes. We are officially back in iTunes with the video version. The audio version, as always, is there, so just go to iTunes, look for the iMore Show. It's available on RSS as well. I want to thank everyone for joining us. And Peter, I think if there's nothing else that caps this week, it's just Apple so doomed.
Apple is so doomed.
Have a good one.
Take care.